everyone. My name is Matthias Waschek. I'm the Jean and Miles McDonough Director of the Worcester Art Museum, and I would like to welcome you to this lecture, which is the Amelia and Robert H. Haley Memorial Lecture. Bill Haley, a former corporator at the Worcester Art Museum, established this annual lecture concerning the world of art in 1989 in honor of his parents, Amelia and Robert H. Haley. And I'm especially pleased to say that his daughter, Amelia, is with us. She's sitting here and has the big smile. And Amelia shared with me two pieces of information that I checked again, that I'm saying it correctly, and should I not, then this is on my tiny brain that quickly forgets. Her dad, who endowed this lecture series, was among those who wrote the Civil Rights Act and who wrote the Right to Vote Act, and there's a different terminology about this. I'm German, sorry, but it's about voting. So, and this is so befitting because this exhibition, which is the starting point for the lecture, is about many things, and it is about civil rights that all of us should have. And after all of this, you want to hear from my dear colleague, Sam Cataldo, who is the curator of the exhibition, who's going to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening for a conversation in celebration of the Worcester Art Museum's current exhibition, Faith Ringgold, Freedom to Say What I Please, which I should note remains on view until March 17th. The exhibition is generously supported by the Fletcher Foundation as well as an anonymous donor, and has also been funded in part by the Don and Mary Melville Contemporary Art Fund and the John M. Nelson Fund with media support from Artscope. So we thank our supporters for making the exhibition possible, and of course, further thank the Haley family for making tonight's talk possible. We are honored to have Dr. Lisa Farrington with us this evening. Following her presentation, it'll be my distinct pleasure to join her up on stage for a conversation, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Dr. Farrington is an award-winning leader in the field of African American art history. She is Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the City University of New York and served as Associate Dean of Fine Arts and Director of the Gallery of Art at Howard University. Among many other achievements and accolades, Farrington has won the Andy Warhol Foundation and Creative Capital Arts Writers' Prize, the Spelman College Atlanta University Endowed Chair in the Humanities, a Ford Foundation Education Fellowship, and 3 national awards for her Oxford University Press book on the history of African American women artists. She is a preeminent scholar of the art of Faith Ringgold, curating exhibitions of Ringgold's work as well as writing about the artist extensively. Books include Faith Ringgold from 2004, which was the first major survey of the complete work of the artist, and Art on Fire, The Politics of Race and Sex in the Paintings of Faith Ringgold from 1999, which focuses on racial, gender, and political iconography in Ringgold's work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Farrington.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and the program for this evening is I'm going to give you a extremely concise, by academic standards, look at Faith Ringgold's art and her impetus for making the art that she came to make. And then Curator Sam and I will have a conversation about Faith's art, and then we will have Q&A. Faith Ringgold has been in my life for more than 30 years. We're friends, we're collaborators, and I was honored to be able to put together this program for tonight. When Faith Ringgold first conceived of her signature art form, which is the story quilt, even she was apprehensive, since her artist's innovations required her to take the quintessential high art form of painting and stitch right through the canvas. I'm not sure she was really feeling comfortable about doing that even at the time. And when she reminisced once to me about how uneasy she felt perpetrating such an aesthetic sacrilege, she said, "What did I think I was doing? You can't sew into a painting." Because truthfully, okay, I keep going off topic, so it might not be as concise as I write these things out so I'll stay within my minutes, but I can't help myself. But truthfully, she doesn't make quilts. She paints paintings that are made into quilts. So she's doing oil or acrylic on canvas first, and then those become the quilt tops, and backing is added, and batting is added to that. So a lot of people aren't clear on that. So with the aid of her Harlem fashion designer mother, who's on your left, her name is Willie Posey, and that was her actual business card, and with the blood of generations of quilt makers running through her veins, in 1980, Ringgold chose one of her own pop art style paintings, appropriately entitled Echoes of Harlem, and used it as her quilt top. She added backing, batting, and fabric trim and sewed the layers together to make her first painted quilt. Since then, Ringgold has become renowned worldwide as the architect of this art form and as an aesthetic innovator par excellence. Ringgold's artistic repertoire constitutes an ever-changing fusion of means and motifs. Hers is a peerless creativity, defined by an inventory of attributes that is nothing short of remarkable. These include, in the words of historian Marcia Tanner, appropriation, pattern, painting, portraiture, sewing, history, personal narrative, African American and European American artistic and cultural forms, rich textiles, gorgeous colors, and complex designs. A transgressive hybrid, if there ever was one. And that's one hell of a quote to describe one artist's work of art, but even though it sounds, too much to be true, it actually is a perfect characterization of Ringgold's artistic production over a lifetime. So Ringgold was interested in creating art that had both words, both text as narrative and imagery as narrative. Most beguiling in her formal arsenal to both academic and neophyte audiences alike are her now famed story quilts. Several years after the creation of Echoes of Harlem, in 1983, Ringgold decided to add discursive vernacular text to her painted quilts by writing directly onto her canvases. This imaginative breakthrough resulted in a word-enhanced version of her creative brainchild that became the bona fide first story quilts. That is, a painted quilt complete with a transcribed tale. Each of Ringgold's word and image-based painted quilts includes a narrative conceived by the artist, and the genre quickly became the hallmark of Ringgold's creative production. So infectious and disarming was her new syntax that beginning in 1991, publishers vied for the rights to translate Ringgold's intriguing paintings into a series of acclaimed and award-winning children's books, including Tar Beach. Extrapolated from a story quilt of the same name, Tar Beach illustrates in words and imagery the aspirations of the fictitious character Cassie Louise Lightfoot. Cassie is an 8-year-old girl of Ringgold's imagination who dreams of flying quite literally beyond the confines of Harlem, her inner-city New York neighborhood, beyond the social constraints of her life as a Black child, and into the unknown territory of her future, an illustrious future that offers Cassie the promise of, among other wonders, longed-for personal freedom. Cassie is, of course, an avatar of the artist who herself grew up in Harlem during the jazz age of the 1930s and 40s, and who lived in an apartment building much like Cassie's, one that stood in the shadow of the George Washington Bridge, that great span that connects New York and New Jersey across the Hudson River, and which was dedicated the year Faith was born. Over a lifetime, Ringgold achieved Cassie's dream. She survived the Depression in Harlem. Isn't that a great shot of her and her brother? She raised 2 extraordinarily talented daughters while dressing like a fashion model. And she overcame the tragic death from drug abuse of both her husband and her brother. And she ultimately became a unqualified international success as an innovative fine artist, a feat few Black women were able to accomplish, particularly given the hermetic nature of the mainstream art community at the time, which was dominated by white and generally male artists, dealers, and curators. Flying in the face of the art world and its racism and patriarchy, Ringgold's semi-autobiographical narrative in Tar Beach takes viewers back in time and offers them a glimpse of a Black girl child's desire to obtain personal independence and success. In the quilt series from which the book was adapted, Cassie is pictured lying on the tar roof of her building, hence the title Tar Beach, watching the stars as she imagines herself soaring like a bird across the George Washington Bridge and into the night sky. So compelling were Ringgold's images and narratives that Tar Beach, the book, quickly won over a dozen literary awards, including the prestigious Caldecott Honor Award and the Coretta Scott King Award for illustration. Ringgold first began to experiment in her paintings with both texts and textiles long before she began quilting them. In her 1973 feminist series, she conceived of one of her first fabric cycles, one that communicated in both form and content uncompromising political arguments against race and gender intolerance and inequity. Indeed, in some circles, Ringgold was better known as a staunch Black feminist and tireless civil rights activist than she was as an artist. In the late 1960s, she spearheaded protest campaigns against New York's Whitney Museum of American Art and the Museum of Modern Art for the exclusion of minorities and women from their collections and exhibitions schedules. During this same period, Ringgold completed 2 major painting cycles that expressed her political views and harshly criticized racial discrimination and violence in America. Entitled American People and Black Light, these early series included works such as The Flag is Bleeding of 1967, which, despite its agitprop content, was nonetheless conceived conventionally as a large-scale figural pop art oil painting on a wooden stretcher. At this stage of her career, Ringgold strove to create Lichtenstein and Warhol-style big pictures. She was actually told to do so by her dealer, because these would be appealing to the mainstream art world. And she was flattered when once her gallery director said that she painted just like a man. Eventually, however, the artist began to question her aesthetic direction and motives. Why must she paint large, heavy canvases? To prove she could? Because dealers and curators preferred them? To accommodate an art scene that placed painting on stretched canvas at the top of the creative evolutionary chart? In the end, none of these reasons seem to justify a protracted suppression of the artist's desire to experiment with alternative media. She also lived in an apartment building that had a very tiny elevator, and a big painting on stretched canvas had to be walked up 14 flights of stairs. So she was really motivated. In 1972, Ringgold left conventional painting behind and turned instead to quote-unquote soft paintings, devoid of stretchers and enhanced by textile edging, the precursors of the story quilts. In making this transition, Ringgold would eventually become known as the artist who, almost single-handedly, raised the tradition of quilt making from the realm of craft to that of fine art. Ringgold achieved this goal not merely by incorporating fabric into her art, but by consistently and incredibly fusing her life, her art, and her politics. More precisely, her works merged her devotion to the battles against sexism and racism, her integrity as a painter, and her genealogy as the offspring of a family of quilters and seamstresses. Ringgold's great-grandmother, Susie Shannon, who was born into slavery, and Shannon's daughter, Betsy Bingham, were both quilt makers, and Ringgold's mother, as we know, was a renowned designer who began her career making army clothing during World War II, and later studied at the Fashion Institute of Technology, or FIT, in New York. Sewing had always been an important activity in the Ringgold household. She recalls in her memoirs that her family had an old-fashioned, I had one of those, but I painted it over and made it a vanity table. She had an old-fashioned foot-pedal Singer sewing machine that had belonged to Ida Posey, her grandmother. Her mother learned to sew on it, and so did Faith. Patterns, fabrics, swatches, and other sewing paraphernalia were familiar sights in Ringgold's childhood home, and her adult interest in textile-based art can be explained, at least in part, by the fact that fabric and sewing held a special place in her memories of childhood. Indeed, right from the beginning, in 1972, Ringgold's mother, who you see on the left there, was an active collaborator in the making of the artist's first textile bordered paintings, choosing the fabrics for edging and helping to sew the textile borders around each. The Ringgold-Posey collaboration began a decade-long creative partnership culminating in the story quilts and ending only with the death of the artist's mother in 1981. The artist viewed her momentous decision to work with fabric media as self-revelatory, in that she, quote, decided to stop denying that part of myself that loved making things with cloth, unquote, and instead to embrace her family and gender heritage as integral to her creativity. Ringgold's ability to coalesce into her work the multiple influences of her life, family, art, and politics, is perhaps most evident in her famed French Collection series, a lavish group of story quilts which lampoon Picasso, Matisse, and Van Gogh, all signifiers of the white male monolith of modernism, within the context of a supple fabric format. The series depicts women of color, painting, posing, dancing, and many women quilting in famed locales such as Giverny, Monet's home, or Vence, the site of Matisse's chapel, Arles, Van Gogh's haunt, and cavorting at the Louvre in Paris, in front of several Leonardo da Vinci masterpieces, daring to upstage the modernist maelstrom. Obfuscating the boundaries between fantasy and reality, the series Dancing at the Louvre is an epic, or the French Collection series rather, is an epic narrative that spotlights a protagonist named Willia Marie Simon, whose intriguing existence as an expatriate African-American artist and model living abroad at the turn of the 20th century plays out on a dozen quilts. While Ringgold's story quilts And by the way, this amazing quilt is owned by the Worcester Museum. Yeah. While Ringgold's story quilts such as Tar Beach and the French collection are today world-renowned, not all of the artist's enthusiasts are aware of how and why Ringgold came to quote-unquote invent the story quilt genre. What circumstances motivated Ringgold to take this new and unorthodox direction, a direction that would ultimately lead her to success as an artist with an art form that was truly her own? The key to this riddle lies in a grand tour of Europe upon which Ringgold embarked in the summer of 1972. While abroad, ostensibly to get creative inspiration from the great European art collections, Ringgold fortuitously happened upon an obscure collection of 14th and 15th century Tibetan paintings known as tankas. Sacred Hindu paintings portraying Buddhas and bodhisattvas, which were framed with brocaded fabric and hung with dowels like tapestries. Ringgold was instantly taken with the classic works of art, which she discovered at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. In her words, quote, "I began to inspect the ancient brocaded cloth frames, so old that some of them were literally in threads. This hidden away exhibition was to have such an impact on my art making in the near future." Once she returned to New York, Ringgold immediately began to adapt the Tibetan technique. She no longer had to be concerned about the labor and expense of storing and moving her large stretched canvases. Quote, "I could do this," she thought. "I could get rid of the frames, the glass, the cumbersome heavy stretchers, and frame my paintings in cloth. That way I could roll up my paintings, put them in a trunk, and ship them the same way I ship my children's clothes to camp." As might be the case with any young artist in the early stages of her career, money was of primary concern to Ringgold. As a struggling artist and mother raising two daughters, Ringgold found the costs of shipping and materials prohibitive. Added to these expenses were those of supporting a family. At that time, the two financial burdens seemed almost insurmountable to the artist. Ringgold once remarked that it was suicide for anyone, particularly a Black woman, to become an artist without proper financial resources, and that if she had it to do over again, she might not. I don't believe that. These sentiments, however, demonstrate her acute awareness of the difficulties she faced as a woman of color, endeavoring to gain recognition in an art world that had little sympathy for women's issues and often greeted Ringgold with both racist and sexist resistance. By framing her paintings in cloth and eliminating the stretcher, Ringgold tapped into her own inimitable creative reserves and empowered herself to continue painting. By the mid-1970s, Ringgold had taken fabric as a medium to the next level by creating soft sculptures, often referred to as her dolls. These three-dimensional creations ranged from life-size African-inspired costumes and masks that could, in fact, be worn by players in artistic performances that Ringgold conceived, to smaller figures resplendent in elaborate sequined evening gowns and feathered hats, incarnations of the real and imagined characters that populated the artist's life. I saw this drag show in New York. And can I say that? Too late. This is so fabulous. I love the purple dolls. Okay, collecting myself. By embracing needlework as a venerable high art form in her sculptures and paintings, Ringgold created a new genre that now, nearly 50 years after its initial conception, is flourishing in contemporary art circles, and which has ultimately led the once struggling artist to success beyond anything she could have imagined. Over time, and after nearly 20 years as an art teacher in the New York City public school system, Ringgold began to teach at the university level. Eventually, she was honored with an appointment as a full professor at the University of California, San Diego, where she taught for 20 years and now has emeritus status. Her works are represented in dozens of major art collections in the US and abroad, and she continued into her 90s to produce quilted paintings about her preferred subject, Black life. In an ongoing print series of the 21st century dedicated to jazz, we see featured titles like Mama Can Sing and Papa Can Blow. And this constitutes a joyous homage to jazz culture and performance, and to the artist's own nostalgic past as the erstwhile wife of a jazz musician during Harlem's heyday. Ringgold's integrity and ingenuity as an artist and her proud persona as a Black woman, daughter, and mother have rightly earned her a permanent place within the very art historical firmament that once had been closed to both Blacks and women. Thank you.
We just wanted to take an opportunity to have an open conversation with each other and bring it to some of the objects that I hope all or most of you have seen in the exhibition across the street, and also give me a chance to ask more questions of Dr. Farrington, and then therefore impart all that information on to you. So I think it's just worth noting, as some of you know, especially if you visited the exhibition or are the many people in this room who are kind of part of the WHAM family, that this quilt in the museum's collection is why this exhibition came together. It is the nexus, it is the reason. Picasso's studio was acquired by the museum in the late 90s. The artist created in the early 90s. As a newer curator to the museum, to have inherited that great acquisition from a former curator is quite wonderful. That the museum as an institution had the foresight to appreciate the artist in her time. Says a lot about the museum. And so we were really thrilled to be able to display the quilt after, I hate to say, a decade of it not being on view at the museum, because it is such an important work, as Dr. Farrington and I will discuss, that it is constantly asked for, requested for exhibitions, and as of late, thankfully, but of course infuriatingly, Faith has had a lot of attention and a lot of major exhibitions. So the quilt has been traveling quite a bit. It's come home, and we wanted to celebrate it with this exhibition. So we're very happy to share it with you. I also encourage you to go see it again and again in the next few weeks, because it will be going to rest, as we say in the museum world, for a bit, because it is a quilt and a textile, so it needs some time out of the light. So starting from this, as Dr. Farrington spoke about a bit, we kind of thought of this work as something that is quintessentially faith, that there's so much going on in the work that speaks to her journey. And we actually pulled the title of the exhibition from the text on the quilt. In the French collection, which Dr. Farrington talked about, there's a whole story through these several quilts, and it's told through these segments of text across the top and the bottom. And here the protagonist is writing back to her aunt in the States, and she says to her that her aunt had once asked her why she wanted to be an artist. At the time, she didn't know, but she says now she knows why, and that her art is her freedom to say what she pleases. And of course, as we know, these characters are all avatars for Faith. And so I wonder if, just coming back to this piece, I'd love to hear any additional thoughts you have on it, especially after seeing it again today and sort of what you've thought about this work as you've been doing your scholarship on her.
There's just so much in there. If you know a little about Picasso, you know that when he was 19, 20 years old, he was collecting, cheap, because he couldn't have any money at the time, African art. There's a photograph up in his studio in 1908 where he has sculptures from Oceania and Africa in his studio that he could barely afford to pay for. And he spent a lot of time in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris looking at African art, and as a result incorporated African and Iberian masks into his famous painting, which is in the background there, the Demoiselle d'Avignon. So Faith was aware of that, and as you can see on the left-hand side, in the area that's theoretically Picasso's studio, his mini collection of non-Western art is inspiring him. So that's, the beginning. There are those who will argue that early modernism, as in Cubism, couldn't have happened without an interest in non-Western art. I think of Gauguin and his incorporation of oceanic art into his painting. Of course, Picasso and the use of the masks, which has a kind of a dark, impetus in his bashing of women, but it turned out okay in the end. So Faith is letting people know that not only that is she aware of and interested in Picasso, but she understands that African art greatly influenced the Demoiselle, which is arguably the first Cubist picture. It's actually a pre-Cubist picture, but by the next year he was doing real Cubist art. And that is because African art, like much non-Western art, is abstract. There are those who think that realistic art is kind of silly, because why are you trying to copy the real world? Why aren't you interpreting it instead? So then she also was dealing with this concept that all models in these master paintings, the nude model was always a European woman, a white woman. And why were there so few, although that's actually, okay, that's another book I'm working on. But why were there so few well-known black women posing nude? Why wasn't the black female body considered an elevated form of beauty? How is that possible, that just because of skin color, the shapes are the same, the forms are the same, so she replaces the traditional female white model with a brown model, Willia Marie Simone. And then, so much more in here. And then the other thing she does is, in the tradition of Edouard Manet, she has the model looking, do you know what I mean? Looking, in this case, above Picasso's head. You know how you look up and to the right when you're thinking? You ever see that? Tell somebody to spell Timbuktu and they'll go, So the model has a brain that's functioning, she's thoughtful. And I think even if Faith hadn't written the model's thoughts around the edge of the canvas, it's very clear that that model is thinking. And if you look at, I would say 90% of the female nudes in paintings, most of which are by men painting women, the female model's head is completely empty. There's nothing behind the eyes, there's just, And so this is a real departure. And I haven't written about this, so you're getting it first here. So that's my thoughts on this.
And I thought, we talked about this earlier, there's a couple more things to go into about Picasso. Obviously, just thinking about the quilt at Wham, but that Picasso is actually a complicated figure for Faith, a little bit of an influence, a little bit of something she took down.
He was held up as a paragon of modernist, virtue and perfection. She's studying at a traditional college, studying at a traditional university, and they're teaching in a traditional manner, and they're saying you have to paint like Cezanne and Picasso, and so of course he was an idol in her university days. But getting to this sculpture,
this slide. The Guernica, which is of course now in the Prado, was not in the Prado. It was in New York at the MoMA. And up until 80, whenever the Spanish wrenched it out of our hands. I think Picasso put it on permanent loan to MoMA until such time he put in his will as Spain would become a democracy. It became a democracy, but then New York fought it for a few more years. But anyway, it's at the Prado now, but it was in New York, so Faith was going into the museum and seeing this particular painting, which is a clear, unequivocal inspiration for her painting Die, which magically, as of this very day, is hanging in the same gallery at the MoMA as the Picasso Demoiselle d'Avignon. That it was hanging at the top. Okay, now I have to tell that story. Who did I tell this story to earlier about how it got there? Anybody? Yeah. So Faith had a huge show in England about just before COVID, and the BBC did a documentary on her, and it was wonderful. And they interviewed her all through the film, and they came to New York to interview the curator of painting and sculpture there about Die, which at the time of the interview was in a very well-populated location, but that was at the top of an escalator and not in any historical room, it was just an audience attraction. And at the top of that escalator, the interviewer from England said to the chief curator, "How is it that Europe is more able to see the value and importance of Faith Ringgold than the people of her own country?" And I'll end by saying, as I said earlier, 2 months later, that painting was moved into the Picasso gallery. And sometimes it takes an outsider to really see these things. But anyway, if you compare the two works, Faith did something very interesting. I think the Picasso work is very complicated. There's a lot going on there. If you know the history, it's about the bombing of this town of Guernica. And so there's a lot of, symbolic metaphors for sorrow and death, and a Pietà image and a screaming horse and that. And newsprint from the actual news media that was reporting on the bombing. And Picasso did something very, very appropriate. He painted it in grisaille, in shades of gray, so that it wouldn't be too complicated. Visually, you could read everything very clearly. What I find amazing about Ringgold's piece is she uses a kind of grisaille grid in the background as an homage to Picasso. But her conflagration is in color, and yet it is completely readable. It is complicated, there's a lot going on, there's blood, there's arms flailing, there's children at the bottom, But she managed, with that gray background, to stabilize all those different elements so they're not flying all over the place. And I think people appreciate Ringgold's art because they intuitively are drawn to it, but they are not necessarily aware of the underlying design skills required to make each one of her very complicated, highly populated works function without looking like a mess, like a cacophony of, I guess that means sounds, but you know what I mean, images, shapes, and colors.
Yeah. And when that rehang happened, I know a lot of people in this room probably saw it and maybe had feelings. It was also kind of controversial because it could be taken two ways of having Die be in the room with Picasso. The intention, I think, was to show the connection and to draw a parallel, saying that if Picasso is here, Faith is also here. But I think the reception was saying, why does it need to be that? Why Faith can't just be Faith? And I'm just curious what your take was.
Well, I understand why it was done. I mean, there are other paintings that are in public locations. I think Franz Marc's Blue Horse is was for years in a kind of public location without belonging anywhere. And theoretically, her painting Die is from the era of pop art, and it actually is in a pop art style. So that would be where it's supposed to go historically. But I think the motivation was, Guernica used to be here. We don't have it anymore. This is an homage to Guernica, therefore an homage to Picasso, so let's just put it in there. I mean, I'm not going to nitpick. It's good where it's good there. It's good there. I'm glad it's there.
And then I just had one more Picasso I wanted to bring back, even though you mentioned it, but it was worth a pull quote, sort of just this reference, this she pulled from a photograph of Picasso. But I think what's interesting about this piece is the people that are in it. And you talked about, I know there's several different people that are important in her life. The artist Emma Amos is one of...
Yeah, Moira Roth. Isn't Judy Chicago in there somewhere?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, feminist artist, basically. Yeah. Oh, there's Linda Freeman. I know her. And there's William Marie, who is now the painter.
The painter.
Yeah.
And so I think that this is like a total subversion here, but then she's also layering these multiple art historical references, which, as you said, is really, I think, a connection to the way she was being trained, but also that she was, at that point, being told that she needed to paint a certain way and like fit into the canon. And so her way of fitting into the canon was inserting it in the satirical way.
Yeah. She was kind of rewriting history.
Yeah.
Which is, this thought just occurred to me. It's another article waiting to happen. We call this movement that's happening in the 2000s to now Afrofuturism, where a lot of African American artists are interested in kind of outer space themes and futuristic themes. And that translates in Hollywood terms into Black Panther, the movie. You know, what if there had never been slavery? Or what would we look like if we had been able to do, meaning black people, to just do our fabulous thing without colonialism and imperialism and all that? So that fantasy has become an art form, an art genre. So we have Black Panther, we have Bridgerton. Oh, don't we love Bridgerton? And what's wonderful about it, I used to lament that people got so much information about their world from Hollywood, but I don't mind this so much. And in small parts, some of these things are true. You know, there were, I'm back on this topic again. I'm sorry that I do this, I just can't help myself. I'm working on a project which the Artist Book Foundation is. I'm not trying to plug it because art books don't make money, as everybody knows. But it's called The World Before Racism. And it uses art only to tell the history of white-black, the relationship between whites and blacks in Europe, and the presence of blacks in Europe, and how that panned out. So things that are written in books are suspect, history books. Why are history books suspect? Yeah, it depends on who's writing them, right? So the bias of the author, the fact that it's almost always a secondary source, right? It's not, you're not going to the original document, you're reading somebody's interpretation of somebody's interpretation of somebody's interpretation. Books are translated into different languages. How many versions of the American Bible? I mean, even if there's such a thing as an American Bible, you know, everything is rewritten constantly. You don't have, sometimes it has no relationship to the original source. So I see art as a primary source document. It's never rewritten. It is exactly what it always is, as long as you go to the original document. So if you look at art that was made throughout the history of humankind by whites, of blacks, the history of racial relations is not what we think it is. Because we learn what we think we know about race relations from written documents from the past. You know, how did slavery happen? What was it all about? Well, so we read it in a book. We don't know. what really happened. We don't know what people really look like. We don't know what they really were unless we go to some original diary. I'm in the middle of a battle and I'm taking notes, like the guy who wrote the Star Spangled Banner. Wasn't he like taking notes about, and the rocket's red glare, So, okay, that's a primary source. But my point is that Faith Ringgold and the Afrofuturist movement in general seems to be fantasizing about something that isn't real. It's a wish fulfillment, if you will, but it's not a wish fulfillment. This time next year, invite me back when that book is out, and we'll learn all about it. So that's fine. And I love this, because we look at this male posing in the typical female pose, and he looks silly. But why? He shouldn't look silly. Women don't look silly, theoretically, if they're posing, because that's what women are supposed to do, be naked around men who have clothes on. And we get so much information about how we see our world from pictures. The problem is we aren't taught how to properly read visual art. It's a language, not that difficult to understand, but we are absorbing subconsciously messages that we may not really want. And once it gets ingrained in our mind, like every second woman in a Renaissance painting or a Baroque painting or a Rococo painting is posing nude and doing nothing, which is another thing I like about Faith's women. They're always doing something. They're thinking, they're running. She's got pregnant women in her slave rape series with axes trying to kill the slave catcher, It's amazing. But women are supposed to be still. They're supposed to be visually available. They are supposed to be semi-clothed or nude. Even nude men are always active. They're running, they're leaping, they're on the back of a horse, they've got a sword in their hand, and The women, nothing. It's ridiculous. So, moving on. We better move on.
Okay. We can go from no clothes to clothes.
Yes.
So the small kind of inset image is an image from the exhibition where we were fortunate to have two of the dolls, as we say, the sort of soft sculptures that are in fabulous condition, as well as one of the early Tonka-inspired works, Windows of the Wedding, which was talked about a little bit in your talk. And when you and I were talking about this lecture, you introduced me to these women's liberation talking masks, which I hadn't really seen before. And so I wondered if, as sort of a supplement to what people could see in the exhibition, you could talk about these other masks that she was making around the same time and the impetus to those sort of wearable sculptures that we're seeing.
What's most important about the talking masks is the arrow that points to the mouth. There's a couple of things going on there. If you look at traditional, I guess it's Mali, sculptures from Mali. I'm trying to think of the group of people. Anyway, it's not important. But in the Metropolitan Museum, there's a wonderful, right at the very entrance to the African sculpture section, there's a wonderful sculpture of Adam and Eve kind of from Mali, a primordial couple. And they have the carving of the wood looks exactly like an arrow pointing down. It's an abstracted nose. So this comes out of that sculpture tradition, but it's also a comment on the fact that women must speak up. Black women in particular, because I don't know how many of you remember the Moynihan Report that came out in '64. I know you probably know Senator Moynihan, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, good old Irish fella. I can say that, my mom's Irish. But he and another man named Nathan Glazer from Harvard or Yale wrote a government research document which became nicknamed the Moynihan Report. And after supposedly doing research, which it turns out they didn't really do appropriately, the report said very clearly that black women, because they were too strong, too assertive, their mouths were too big, they were emasculating their men, and they were the reason that black men were not thriving. This was widely read, widely publicized, and widely believed. So the stereotype of the loudmouth matriarch who makes her husband feel, like nobody, became cemented in the academic community in addition to, the general population. Instead of it being just a funny character that it was prior to that time. And black women bought into this because everybody bought into it. And they felt, we better be quiet because we don't want people to think we're those women who are, instead of the real reasons that black men weren't thriving, economic depravity and racism, must be the women ruining them, I'm getting mad just thinking about it. So, of course, that Moynihan report was debunked within a couple of years, but nobody read that. Nobody read the later articles. So many black women went into sort of Donna Reed mode. And if you look at the TV shows that came out, like Julia, I don't know if you remember Julia, and wasn't she so sweet? She never said anything mean. She was always such a good mother. I mean, really, but black women, including Faith, were punished if they were outspoken and self-promoters, which Faith was both of those things. So Faith was treated poorly by museum curators, by black male artists, because she was vocal and outspoken and a staunch political activist. And she was very hurt by that phenomenon. I won't name any names, Romeo Bearden, but some people said some really cruel things to her and treated her badly because they also had this Moynihan report concept in their head that black women are not supposed to speak up. So this is where the arrow to the mouth comes, where she decided, you know what, I'm not going to stop speaking up. But it was difficult because it was the age of black power, black liberation. That was a very patriarchal movement. I mean, if you belonged to the Black Panther Party and you were a woman, well, you better just get the coffee and keep your mouth shut, So Faith had a lot to deal with at the time. And when she decided to join the feminist movement, where she didn't quite fit in either because that was mostly a white movement, she found her place because the women of the feminist movement really embraced her. And they loved her courage, her fearlessness, her willingness to speak out. We'll see in the Judson 3.
I just put it, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she did these political posters telling women to speak up. She did posters for freeing Angela Davis from prison. She used these wonderful Kuba cloth patterns, the chevron patterns from the Congo, in the kaleidoscopic designs of many of her posters. She did get arrested and dragged into jail for co-curating a show with two German young artists on using the flag as a political symbol to critique the US. I think you might have that, yeah. Yeah, Jean Tosh and, okay, I'm getting old.
John Hendricks.
John Hendricks, thank you. The three of them got arrested because they put a show up near NYU's campus that used the American flag to, critique. And it wasn't just the three of them. There were many artists in the show, but just the three of them were there when the police showed up. And they were convicted of flag desecration because flag desecration was illegal until 1989. So they were too soon, So she struggled with this, whether she joins the ranks of black women who quietly stand behind her men. Look at Rosa Parks. Everybody thinks she was this little old lady. She couldn't have been a little old lady for the whole 50 years, the last 50 years, She was a young, politically active woman who was a member of the NAACP, an officer in the NAACP. Nobody ever says that, oh, this sweet little old black lady. No, she wasn't. You know, she was a political activist. She became a little old lady when she died a few years ago. You know, then she was a little old lady. So the black women struggle with this. As you can see, I don't struggle with this. But I know many black women of my generation who still struggle with this because the stereotype of the loud, aggressive black woman, which is all over the media and the television, makes up this little 1% of the real rest of us, you know. So Faith had to deal with that, and she found a way around it, which is the miracle of Faith Ringgold, that she never gave up. She found a way to navigate all of this negative energy standing in the path of her goal. She's just my heroine. Mm. Yeah.
I just wanted to share just the one last, what we would call political print
right.
in the exhibition, which we at WAM have found since displaying it, and you and I talked about when we were looking at it, is so powerful, but also so terribly depressing, because it is as relevant today as it was 50 years ago when she created it. And we've had a lot of great responses to the work, but I think you said, you know, if we kept filling it in, it would be black, completely black by now. And I'm wondering if you could, you know, speak a bit to Faith's impulse to use her art, as you said, to be a primary source eventually. Of course, maybe she's not, you know, realizing that, but you know, this print, United States of Attica, is related to the Attica uprisings and was created by Faith in honor of the men who died in those uprisings. And it's written across it are all of these, what she calls instances of American violence, so both domestic and abroad, American imperialism abroad. Lost my train of thought on the question. But yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you know, prints like this, objects like this, which are very overtly political. They don't involve a figure or an avatar for herself, but they're still very much about her art form and what she's doing.
I'm not sure. I mean, this is a one-off. None of the other political posters look like this one. I think I have to address that more broadly in that politics, violence, oppression is an ongoing, always, start to finish part of certainly African American life. I don't think people, even sometimes African Americans, don't realize the little what did Shakespeare call it, slings and arrows. They're poking at you all the time, all day, every day, till you get, you don't even realize it's happening. So that politics and black life are not, you can't separate them, impossible. And so Faith's living in the 60s and the 70s, which were so intensely political, civil rights and black power movements, probably the most intense political periods we've seen. We haven't seen another one like those eras, have we, since? Where Americans were really engaged and we were battling it out over some political issue? You know, marching on campus? I don't think so. I think people are on their phones and doing, YouTube videos, and the kids are not politically engaged. I mean, I taught university for 30 years, and my kids, sadly, and, at different schools, private school, public school, they just don't care so much about politics as we did when we were younger. So Faith's artwork, like the United States of Attica, think of that movie with Dog Day Afternoon. Isn't he saying that, Attica?
Yeah.
And he's chanting. Even in Hollywood films, this idea of oppression and government violence was part and parcel of life. So we have to put ourselves in that moment. And we were talking earlier, where's the director? Over there. We were talking earlier about the fact that during this era, art, by and large, with the exception of militant black art, was non-political, was apolitical. People were living in this intensely militant era, but they were painting soup cans. And we still have to finish that conversation, so I haven't quite really put that together, how that could possibly be, and how African American artists whose works, like Reginald Gammon and Faith, how could their works were being shunned by the art community because they were speaking to the politics of the age. One would think that art is a reflection of a culture and what's happening in that culture. But pop art, minimalism, the abstract expressionism even, were not clearly reflective. They were almost like a rejection of real life in some ways. So my point is that Faith was not alone. There were any number of artists, African American, who were making political art, and they were being ignored by the galleries and museums because, unlike Lichtenstein and Warhol and Richard Serra and all these others, and Martin Puryear, who's African American but nothing political, that they dared to go against the art community's mandate that art should not be political.
Well, I think that that's something that's carried throughout Faith's career, and there's many different artworks that I would say embody that, feminist phrase of the personal is the political.
Yes.
And then there's also the work that is the political is the political.
Political is the political, yeah.
Which brings us to this newer group of work, these 6 paintings that we're really thrilled to have in this exhibition, that Faith made from a confluence of influences, but the main one being the historic election of Barack Obama. And so she was thinking of that, of American presidencies, of American democracy, the history of America, and took on this project to think about the Declaration of Independence, the words within it, how it came about, who wrote it, how it became the founding document, and what did that look like during, the quote-unquote American Revolution, and what does that look like for the lives and experiences of enslaved Africans, African Americans, Black Americans living in this country today. And so she sort of tells that story throughout. The left panel is illustrating something related to colonial times, to that, the colonists' fight for freedom from the crown. And then the right side is the ongoing struggle for civil rights, for equal rights for Africans and African Americans. And so these are just a couple closer of those two. So the first, she takes phrases from the Declaration and illustrates them. So one is all men are created equal. She's showing, of course, the king on top of the colonists. And then the other side to that is the ship coming over with people, with these enslaved Africans. And then the only one that doesn't come from a direct quote is this one that I love, and I thought we could talk about a little bit, which she just calls "and women." Mm-hmm. So the Declaration of Independence does not say anything about women. If you didn't know, you read it again. And so this was her painting where she was thinking about what's not in there. And so on the left is, again, a Grisey portrait of Abigail Adams, and written over her portrait is this letter, a fairly well-known letter that she wrote to her husband that basically said, honey, when you guys sit down to write this, don't forget the women. And of course they didn't. And then on the right, we have that very famous Ain't I a Woman? So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about this This is the most recent work in the show, but of course, as we know, Faith is basically still making and just had a birthday a few months ago.
94.
94, yeah.
Well, I think you've covered it.
Well,
Yes. But I will say what Samantha is not saying, which she told me today, is what you have in the show here are the original paintings. This is a print series, but the prints were made from 6, I think, original paintings that have, I don't think, ever been shown in a museum.
Probably not in a museum, I think
Right.
just once.
Right. And Samantha wrenched them out of the gallery's storage. And so what you're going to see when you see the show is the original paintings, as you pointed out, with all little artist notes and scribbles on them that nobody else has seen because the prints are very clean. So that's amazing.
But these were also, I think this is true, but you would know. I believe when she originally made these, it was during a time where she had been having a lot of her work published. She was specifically making things to be published, books on Martin Luther King Jr., books on Rosa Parks. And I think that she made these with the intention of it being a book. And the publisher didn't want anything to do with it.
Yeah.
Which is interesting to see it now, because I think it would be a very different situation.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's amazing to me that these things still matter, but I had a thought about this. It was a really good one, too. While you were talking, I was thinking, and women, too, made me think about it. About the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence, and then the Constitution. Something you said struck me. So you're a wealthy white woman and you own slaves in 1859. Come 1864, 65, with the amendments of 68 and 69, I think it was the amendments in 68, your slaves are now free and can vote, but you, wealthy white woman, cannot vote and will not be allowed to vote for another 50 years. So just think about that. What is more powerful in this country, racism or sexism? I always fall back on sexism because of that particular historic issue, that the slave owners would rather give the right to vote to their slaves than to their wives. I mean, that's just scary, you know. And then we come back to Faith Ringgold, double whammy, because she's a woman and she's black. So you get both types of oppression. Because if you know the history of Sojourner Truth and the suffragette movement, the white suffragettes didn't want anything to do with these black ladies because they figured their husbands wouldn't give them the right to vote if they included black women in the mix. So where Ain't I a Woman, I think Sojourner, was it Sojourner?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. Said that, addressing this very issue. I'm a woman, why can't I be part of the suffragettes? That's what she was saying at the time. So art is supposed to, in my I say humble opinion, but it's obvious to everyone in the room I'm not so humble, that art is supposed to tell you something important, if it's good art, about the era in which it was made. And I think in many cases great art always does that, but sometimes it does it in strange, backhanded ways. But Faith Ringgold is neither strange nor backhanded. She's very straightforward and also an artistic powerhouse.
I think that just on that, there's just one more group of works in the exhibition that I wanted to talk about as our way to end and then open it up to conversations. This is a group of 4 works that were all made in the 1980s after Faith lost her mother, which, as you all now know, after Dr. Farrington's great presentation, was a tremendous loss for the artist. I mean, losing your mother, of course, tremendous for anyone. But her mother was her mother, her partner in art, her influence in art making. So her art was very tied to her mother. And so when her mother died, she worked abstractly for a while because, as she said, she felt she couldn't work the way she was working before. And these are just two of those works. And I think for me, and some of the folks I've talked to in the exhibition, these are kind of the surprise works because they don't think of faith as being abstract because of what we've all just seen in the last hour, the narrative work, the storytelling. But you had some really interesting things to say when we were looking at these together about the idea of narrative and abstraction, if you want to share.
Well, let's see, what are we looking at here? Okay, so a couple of things. The one on the left, there's some videos you could probably YouTube that shows Faith, I think in a Paris studio or somewhere in France in a studio, painting. And how she paints is by blocking out in large patches of color her figures. She doesn't delineate them at all first. She just blocks it out. And a painting by Faith would look exactly like this, halfway finished. You know what I mean? She has, I don't know if this is the same one. She'll block out a head, she'll block out a shirt, just so she knows that the colors are going where they're going, which means she has to begin with a sense of design, a sense of color, abstractly. She has to know this color looks good here, it's not going to be too heavy down here. So in terms of, we've talked a lot about the content of her art, but we haven't, and we've talked about form too, but we haven't talked about the form of her painting, how these paintings come to be. So I think, Faith never told me this, that she must have come upon this idea of these abstract, in many ways very abstract expressionist kind of style, by blocking out her paintings and then stopping, deciding, wait a minute, that looks fine and beautiful and weighs right and, balances just the way it is. But what Samantha reminded me of today, that she started on this abstract journey right after her mother died. And so the picture on the right, for example, is clearly not a block out of a figurative work. It is a truly abstract, beautifully well balanced in a, dare I say, Jackson Pollock kind of way. The colors weigh perfectly. There's not too much of anything. That's not an easy thing to do. So what occurred to me was that she was in a very special frame of mind, a moment of loss of her mother, which when we lose our mothers, we often think about things that are much deeper, more spiritual. When you lose a loved one, you let go of your ego a little bit and you think about religion maybe, or the afterlife, or you become more spiritual, at least in those moments. And spirituality, in my study of art history, seems to often go hand in hand with abstraction. Because if you, on the first day of school at university when I was teaching, I'd have my students draw, two volunteers would come up to the blackboard, I'd say, okay, draw a flower, and somebody would draw a flower. And then I'd tell the other student, okay, draw anger. And, what? Why did I get the hard thing? But invariably, the student, after 30 seconds of thinking, would just draw some jagged line. It's almost always the same jagged line every year, doesn't matter who the student is, the same line. And that line was abstract. You see my point? So abstraction cannot be articulated in figurative form. Abstract ideas like love, hate, pain, anger, loss, these are abstractions. So abstract art is an ideal way to speak when one is feeling or immersed in an abstract state of mind. And my argument, although I have been a little bit shaken, my argument's a little shaken, is that if I think back historically, cultures in their moments, certainly in the West, in their moments of great spirituality, revert to abstracted art, like distortions of the human figure. So I think of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, figurative, realistic portrayals, right, of pretty much everything. But then Christianity comes along, and all that perfect human figuration disappears and is replaced by thin bodies, stained glass windows, distorted forms, abstracted, flat, Byzantine flatness, and stylized, robes and that sort of thing. And then when we get to the Renaissance, which is again very humanistic age, just like ancient Greece, we're back to realism again. So, but then when abstraction comes along again with Picasso and even back further, Cézanne, I have to decide why then. I think the camera had a lot to do with it, but I'm working on that theory. I shouldn't have the theory first and then try to prove it, but that's where I'm at. Yeah. So that's my story.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
We wanted to make sure in the last couple of minutes, if anyone had any pressing questions, we'd love to have them from the audience.
She didn't show in that gallery ever again. That's the truth.
I'll just repeat the question since he didn't have the microphone. He asked what the response was when Faith went from the big framed stretched paintings to rolling them from her galleries or other art establishments.
Yeah, so she found a new audience through her colleagues in the feminist art movement. Many of those women taught at universities, and they decided, or I should say they supported her in showing at university exhibitions. That's where she really got her start. And she didn't ship the big paintings to those exhibitions because they cost a fortune to store, to ship, to crate. So she packed up the quilts and sent them to the university exhibits. The universities saved money. They paid Ringgold to talk instead of paying the shipper. And it turned out beautifully because that seed of feminist professors and, like Judy Chicago, I think was out in California at the time at the Feminist Art Institute, I think it was. And what's Judy Chicago's collaborator?
Miriam Shapiro.
Miriam Shapiro, yeah. So that's what happened. She had to find an audience of women who then expanded her audience to bring the men back in.
There's a question at the back.
Very simple question. Just wanted to ask the name of the BBC documentary.
It's called, sorry, I have to look it up.
It would probably come up if you just Googled it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got a really cool name too.
And it was 2019, or was it 2020 when it came out?
It was 2019 when it came out. I'll find it. I'll give it to you afterwards. It's something like Tell It Like It Is, or something like that.
Faith Ringgold is a political artist. What's your say about some art organizations who are not accepting political art from artists because they claim they're concerned or worried about funding or money from donors?
So she's asking, in Faith's time, making art that was political or controversial, your thoughts on especially now, institutions who are hesitant to show art like that because of the controversy it might bring to them.
I don't really, at the moment, we're in a, magic African-American art bubble where everybody's showing African-American art. If there's an institution that's not going to show it because it's political, they're just they're behind the times. They're in, I don't know where they are, in a cave somewhere. But since the murder of George Floyd, sadly, that marked a real turning point in the attitudes of white America towards African Americans. I mean, not that lynching hasn't been happening all along, but that particular moment, because of the way it happened and the way it was filmed and how long it took for the man to die on camera, it was just so horrible. People really were horrified that something like that could still happen. And depending upon what the person, if there was a political person or a lawyer, they did that, whatever they could do from their arena. The art community was galvanized. People wanted to collect more Black art. They wanted to find out what the heck, how does this African American art community, how is that related to the larger picture of the oppression of African Americans? So people who are already in the art community started to show an interest in African American art. So let me just tell you now, if you haven't already bought your African American art, you're going to pay top dollar right now, because the prices have gone through the roof. We're talking millions and millions and millions of dollars for a Kehinde Wiley, or even a Faith Ringgold at this point. The one you bought, you couldn't afford now. So if there are institutions that are at this particular magical moment in time, because we in the African American art historical community don't believe it's going to last, but that's because we're old and grouchy and pessimistic. But this is a really amazing moment. Kehinde Wiley was named by Time magazine one of the 10 most influential people, forget artists, in the world. So whatever those institutions are, don't patronize them. They don't know what they're doing.
I think we have time for one more if there was one, but if not, that's as good of a place as any to end. Well, thank you all.